So for this video, I'm going to be going through, reviewing, and talking about each of the black improvement cards in Artifact. And if you haven't seen any of the other review videos before, I don't give any sort of numerical rating. There's no 4 out of 5 stars, anything like that. Instead, I talk about, are they good in the current meta as of filming this? Are they good in draft? If they're not good in either of those, I try to explain why and what to look for in the future that could make them good so that you can make educated decisions about how to utilize these cards. So with the caveat explanation out of the way, let's go ahead and dive right in, and we're going to start off with Escape Route. This is a 1 mana improvement, and it says active of 1, so a cooldown of 1, return an allied hero to the fountain. This is essentially a reusable town portal scroll for a lane, and that has the potential to be really powerful. One of the things that I really like about this card is that it's not only returning black heroes, it's not color limited other than when you play the card, so this could be really useful. Now, the problem with a card like Escape Route, and the reason that this card doesn't see a lot of constructed play, for example, is that you'll end up, as you progress in your experience in Artifact, you'll end up needing to redeploy less and less and less. Cards like Town Portal Scroll, cards to some extent like Blink Dagger, though that one has some other utility uses, and even cards like Escape Route, they're very, very handy when you first start playing the game. If you don't understand hero deployment, sometimes you overcommit to a lane, sometimes things just end up not where they need to be. Cards like this can bail you out, right? If you're a new player, Escape Route can be used a bit as a crutch. But the better you get at the game, the better you get at lane deployment, hero deployment, you need it less and less. So while it looks really good on paper in something like Constructed, it ends up just kind of being a wasted slot. Now, this could be good in the future if there is ever any sort of synergy or mechanic that is rewarding you for having your heroes at the fountain. Right now, it's usually a detriment because there's cards like Routed, for example. But if there's something that buffs your heroes at the fountain, or if you have a hero that every time they go back to the fountain, maybe they get some sort of benefit, maybe that's their passive, then this card could end up being much, much better. Now, this card is actually pretty decent in draft. I would say more so in draft than Constructed because, one, in Constructed you do have access to things like Blink Dagger pretty reliably, and in draft you do not. The other reason this is more useful in draft, in my opinion, is that you're more likely to see effects that actually send your heroes to other lanes. Like Intimidation is a card, for example, that sees a lot of play in draft, but not necessarily much, if any, in Constructed. And so Escape Route can be used as a utility insurance against somebody trying to blow your heroes away. Same thing with Beastmaster and his signature ability. There are just more movement effects that pop up in draft than there are in Constructed, and Escape Route can be something that helps you there. So it's not terrible in draft, not something I prioritize, right, because it doesn't impact the board, and I don't benefit from it if I'm an experienced player and I need something bad to have happened to me if I'm trying to counter what my opponent has done, right? There's all these qualifiers, but at the end of the day, it's not terrible in draft, and it just doesn't have a place in Constructed right now. So let's go ahead and move on to Trebuchets, or Trebuchets, or Trebuchets, or however you want to say it, whatever way makes you smile. The point is, it is a 1 mana improvement, and it deals 2 piercing damage to the enemy tower before the action phase. This card is typically just too slow to make an impact in Constructed. Again, it doesn't improve your board state. It does reliably deal damage, even through something like Vesture of the Tyrant, because of the piercing damage, but 2 damage a turn. If you play this turn 1 and you get value out of it on turn 1, by the time that you hit mana turn 10, right, you have still not done as much damage as like a Bolt of Damocles would do on mana turn 10. So it's just a slow trickle over time. I mean, it's reliable, but it's just not impactful and constructed. And honestly, if I'm being honest, when I first started playing the game, I picked it a little bit more often in draft. I'm just not even a big fan of it in draft anymore. Every now and then, like, 2 damage matters, sure, like we've all been there, but for the most part it doesn't impact the board in any measurable way, and sometimes you play it in a lane and then you end up losing that lane, or at least losing control of that lane. So like if you get somebody's lane down to like 20, but then they either nuke the lane with Annihilation or they start making some sort of comeback through a big combo play. This sitting in a lane that has like 20 health but you have no presence in it is basically a dead card. It will never do enough damage on its own to close that lane out, so the lack of board impact here has just made me not really a fan. Alright, bitter enemies. Oh, I do want to say one last thing about trebuchets. Again, talking about cards that could make it better. You're looking for cards that would trigger off of whenever damage is done to the enemy tower, right? Like if there's a hero who has like some sort of passive ability or something that lets you trigger after an enemy tower has been damaged, then, you know, maybe it rises in value. Alright, so bitter enemies. This costs 2 mana. After the combat phase, remove a charge from bitter enemies. Before the action phase, if there are 0 charges on bitter enemies, deal 6 damage to both towers. So you play this in a lane, and then after the combat phase, so when things resolve, it goes from 3 to 2 counters. Then the next turn from 2 to 1, and then 1 to 0, and then on the following turn before the action phase, if there are 0 charges, you deal 6 damage to both towers. This is like a worse trebuchet. The only weird thing here is that it deals 6 damage to both towers, so maybe in the future, or you'll have some sort of like mechanic where if your tower takes damage you get a benefit and this could self-trigger that, but right now this costs 2 mana instead of 1 like trebuchet, and this hits both towers and you don't get any value until all of the charges are gone, so they have plenty of time to potentially react to this and remove it. So like this just feels bad, and the fact that this is a rare kind of blows my mind. It is not good. You know, in theory, you could try to set up some really cool burst damage thing where, you know, you play 3 bitter enemies into a lane and then you try to set it up so that they all like go off at the same time and deal like 18 damage. But, I mean, you're just setting a ticking time bomb, and then even still, there's no guarantee it'll be enough. I'm just not a fan. So that's that. Let's move on. Unsupervised Artillery. 2 mana. Has an active of 1, deal 4 piercing damage to the enemy tower, may only be used if there are no unblocked enemies. So because it says no unblocked enemies, you basically can activate this when you are swarming your opponent. You have to have an equal or greater force, and then you can activate this to deal 4 piercing damage. That's, you know, double the clock, if you will, of trebuchet. 4 is pretty significant. That's a 10-turn clock on its own, and that's not counting incidental damage that you get through, but it is conditional on the activation, so you do have to consider that. And unlike trebuchet, you have to activate this. So in close games where initiative matters, you might have moments where you could activate this but don't want to because you don't want to give up initiative. So all in all, I put this on a very similar power level to trebuchet because of the conditional nature of its activation. If anything, I would say it's probably slightly higher than trebuchet in draft because 4 burst damage like 2 times in a row is just more significant. Like you can play trebuchet and after 2 turns you've done 4. If you play this in a lane you're trying to snowball and you get 8 extra damage, that's pretty significant. But again, not good enough right now in constructed because of all of the conditions that need to be met. And in draft, you know, like I said, sometimes you can get some value out of it. I do think it's, you know, better than trebuchets overall. So there you have it. All right, Assured Destruction. All heroes have +4 siege. This is a pretty interesting card because on the one hand it creates massive inevitability. Basically, like in lanes that would be stalling, as long as heroes are present, you're going to be pushing damage through. But it's all heroes. So your opponent's heroes have siege damage as well. And like some other improvements in other colors, this means it has the potential to backfire. So this is certainly the sort of thing you would want to use in aggressive decks, and specifically ones where you're likely wanting to put, 2 or 3 heroes into a single lane at a time. I could see this potentially used, and I did test it a little bit in the closed beta this way, in something like a very aggressive blue-black deck where you're trying to win a single lane with Canna, and then 3, sometimes even 4 of your other heroes go into a single other lane to try to push that, right? Like that's your division of power. And in cases where you're doing that, where you frequently have 3 heroes in a lane, this can add up quickly, right? Like 3 heroes represents 12 siege damage. So it is the sort of thing that I keep earmarked in the back of my head. Ultimately, my testing in the closed beta proved to just be not quite good enough. The problem is that siege damage does still require combat to go through, and Annihilation prevents combat, so that was a bit of a problem. But it is a card that I try to keep in the back of my mind, because as the meta shifts, if Annihilation falls out of favor and you get more like combat heavy, this could be a boon to some aggressive decks. I do think this is a more constructed playable than draft playable, because in constructed you can execute your game plan a little bit better. Going in how to best take advantage of a card like this. In draft it's kind of a crapshoot. I mean, I'm not saying you're never going to get value out of it, but this does have the chance to backfire on you. And then taking it a step further, this doesn't impact the board very well, and in draft specifically I like cards that really play up the fundamentals and the core gameplay mechanics, and this card just doesn't really do that. So I think it's more of a constructed card, and it's on the cusp of being playable in the right deck, but not quite there yet. Iron Fog Goldmine. 3 mana, you get 3 gold after the combat phase. This card it's really interesting. When I first started playing, I very, very highly valued it. I was drafting it like above creeps. I was playing it in a bunch of payday decks. I was doing all the things because I felt like, if I could ramp my gold, it was a sure path to victory. And then, like, reality set in, and I remembered that, you have to have bodies on the board to win. Doesn't matter how much gold I have if everything on my side of the board is dying. And I've kind of toned down my opinion of this. It's still entirely playable. It is probably playable in some constructed decks, but I think it's borderline. A lot of times, if you're playing a black gold generating deck, just Bounty Hunter and Payday are enough. You typically don't need the consistent gold this provides. I think that this is fine as a 1, maybe even a 2 of, but likely fine as a 1 of in draft to get you consistent gold. But you don't want too many of these unless you have, just like crazy synergy or something. But you don't typically want too many of these because, again, fundamentals, core gameplay, you need a presence on the board, and this doesn't necessarily do that, but it does provide you some good utility. So certainly playable in draft. I just don't prioritize it the way that I used to, and I'm comfortable with that stance. Obviously, in the future, anything that synergizes with gold or as new items get released, keep it in the back of your mind, but that's the gold mine. Path of the Cunning. 3 mana, after you play a black card, modify a random ally with +1 siege. This is a card I tried to make work in a mono black deck in the beta, and it ended up still just not being good enough. Much like, the red card and the blue card, because it is random, right? Blue card is random damage to an enemy. The red card was buff a random ally. And this one is same thing, modifies a random ally. There's no guarantee you're getting the kind of long-term value you want out of this. If this was always modifying a random hero, this card would skyrocket in value, in my opinion. Being able to consistently put siege on heroes and then redeploy them is pretty important, especially for aggressive black decks. But really, this is like, you know, just +1 tower damage every time you play a black card, and that's just not really good enough. As far as the future goes, you know, pay attention to black cards. Excuse me, I'm stuttering. Pay attention to cards that benefit from siege damage, potentially. Alright, Revtel Investments. 3 mana. You add a charge to Revtel Investments after the combat phase. And as an active of get 4 gold for each charge, but then you condemn the investments. So this is like the risk-reward version of goldmine. Goldmine costs 3 and you get 3 gold per turn after combat. This one costs 3, but you technically get 4 gold per turn after combat. But once you get that gold, then you're not getting it anymore, and you have to activate this, and you're not getting gold each turn. It's like in one big go. So the longer you let this sit, the greedier you try to be, the more likely it might get blown up by, like, smash the defenses or something like that. So this is, you know, like I said, it's the risk versus reward comparison to goldmine. Personally, I just think goldmine's better. In the decks where I was running gold generating stuff beyond track and payday, I was running goldmine over investments because the 4 versus 3 gold isn't enough of a reward to be worth the risk, and the fact that you have to activate this means that again, there might be times where you want to activate this, but you can't do so because you're trying to preserve initiative, and that always felt clunky to me. I think it's fine to play in draft. Again, like I said, sometimes running a 1-of goldmine is fine in draft. Same thing falls for this. If you don't draft a goldmine, but you pick up an investment, it's fine to play 1. Alright, the Oath. This is my favorite black improvement. 3 mana. You cannot play spells or creeps while this is active, or while this is the active lane. If there's an allied black hero in this lane, allies have +4 attack. So you can still play other improvement cards, and that's really important. That's the reason that Tinker is played so often in decks that utilize the Oath, because you can still play March of the Machines from there, and you can still use Tinker's activated ability and other activated abilities. But this card is very, very powerful. It can very quickly turn a tower to dust, and even an ancient to dust, especially played in multiples. You know, I've been playing a lot of like blue-black aggro, for example, and there's nothing more satisfying than setting up like a dimensional portal on turn 4, maybe a prey on the weak on turn 5, and then on turn 6, you drop a double Oath, and just nuke a tower, or, you know, after you've nuked a tower, you can drop a double Oath on a wide board and nuke an ancient. It's just a really powerful card. It pushes towers incredibly fast. It's very good in constructed. It's very good in draft, and it'll probably be at least considered for decks for a very long time. Just check the tournament scene. If you want to see some good aggressive decks, there's some really good red-black ones floating around that make great use of the Oath. Alright, Keen Folk Turret. This costs 4, has an active on a 1-turn cooldown that deals 2 piercing damage to a unit. This is okay. Doesn't really see playing constructed very often. I think I've only seen it in 1 or 2 decks, and in those it was like a 1-of for utility. But it does see a lot of play in draft. It does have an impact on the board. It's not as impactful necessarily as playing a creep, but it can generate a lot of value over time, and the fact that it's piercing damage is very useful because it can get through some pesky heroes that stack armor or equip armor items. Even beyond heroes, just being able to deal extra damage to creeps and kind of clear a path for your own to deal damage means that this is a reasonable improvement that you know, you can feel comfortable playing in draft. It's not like super high priority, but I mean, I pick it pretty consistently. Alright, the Tyler Estate. 4 mana. Both towers have -2 mana. I tried really hard to make this work in the closed beta, and it just wasn't really working out. I think Tyler Estate Censor, the creep, is just significantly better at doing what this wants to do, because even just -1 mana is enough disruption to slow people down, but the fact that it's on a big resilient body is more important than this being an improvement, and this is both towers. So Estate Censor allows you to kind of like snowball your tempo. This is the kind of card that you want to play in a lane you've already established. So if you go wide, right, like again, talking about like that blue-black aggro deck I mentioned, if you maybe play a Dimensional Portal and then you play your Prey in the Weak and you expect Annihilation to be coming, then you could drop Tyler Estate just the same way you would a Censor, and then hope that you can ride it out. Because you're not going to be playing much either in those scenarios, right? You're trying to slow down your opponent, but it's also hindering you, so you want to already be winning a lane. The biggest issue with this is that At Any Cost is a card that exists in Constructed, and it does see play, and a lot of the times, by the time you've established a board and then you play this to prevent the Annihilation, they just play At Any Cost and nuke your stuff anyway. So I tried, I just couldn't get it to work. Sometimes, every now and then, we'll try to play it as a one-of in draft, but I've never got the utility to really work very well there either, for a lot of those same reasons. Like, it's a win more card. You kind of want to already be winning a lane, and then you play this to maintain your superior presence. Sometimes it works, and most of the time it doesn't. Alright, last up we have the Big Daddy Steam Cannon. This costs 7 mana, has an active that's on a 1-turn cooldown, but this deals 4 piercing damage to a unit in any lane. So this is the big brother of Keenfolk Turret, but the big key difference is not just that it doubles the damage. You go from 2 piercing damage to 4 piercing damage. The big benefit of Steam Cannon is that it is in any lane. This card is a headache if it gets resolved and multiple uses, especially in the first lane, because you can really set up what happens in lane 2 and lane 3 by picking off heroes. It is sadly still not really played much in Constructed though. Annihilation and At Any Cost and some of those blue cards are already good enough to stall the game, and if you're playing blue-black, where you would be including this in a control deck that wants to stall, you're likely also including, you know, heroes like Phantom Assassin that also have good spot removal. So a card like this ends up being kind of redundant in Constructed. It's good, but there's just better, more consistent options that you're already including, so this ends up just not being worth it. If this could deal damage to towers, right, if this was any target and not just units, I actually think you would see this played in like blue-black control. But because it's units and there's already so many tools in Constructed to deal with units, it just doesn't quite make the cut there. In draft, however, this can sometimes just single-handedly win you the game. It is that good. It represents doing a lot of damage every turn, and because it's piercing and it's any lane, it is wildly versatile, and it is a force to be reckoned with in draft. So it is very, very powerful there, and a nightmare to deal with. So anyway, that's it. That's the last improvement. There you have it. If you made it this far, I love you and appreciate you. Thanks for watching through the reviews. If you think I missed something or got something wrong, you can tell me in the comments. I love getting feedback, and honestly, I just love talking about Artifact and the game and cards, because I really do enjoy it, and I think that dialogue is great. So anyway, I hope that I will catch you again in the next video.